Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. This is part 2 of the Tex Rickard Career Profile. I am your host, Sean, and I'm joined as always by Johnston to tell the second part of the Tex Rickard story. And in the first part, you've heard all about how Tex makes his money and then loses it and then gets it back with a turn of a card. All the Klondike story, which was a really fascinating story, like you said, Johnston, something that people should go and look up and watch and look about the documentaries, because it is really fascinating as a side story. But the whole story of Tex Rickard and his journey into the boxing world has been a really interesting one. And so far, we've learned about 2 big fights that he's promoted: Joe Ganson battling Nelson, and then, of course, Jim Jeffries and Jack Johnson. 2 of the biggest fights of that particular era, and Tex Rickard is essentially the mastermind behind both of them. But now we're at a point of the story where he's kind of had enough now, and he's gone to South America and he's decided, you know what, I'm going to go back to going on the cattle ranch and doing what I used to do when I was a lot younger.
Yeah, and that's precisely what we're going to go on to next, and all the other stories are beyond that. But yeah, as you say, I mean, he was even a marshal in Texas. I mean, the guy's done pretty much everything. He wins and loses money. He's ahead of the Great Stampede at the Klondike, and 2 of the great fights of the century. The first one, Nelson, as you said, and then another, the greatest fight of the century, Jeffries and Johnson. As you say, Sean, that is bang on. The fact is it's the racism element of what happened after Jack Johnson, which we didn't go into too much, but it was horrific, and it put him off boxing. So that's why he decided to go. So on February 11, 1911, Rickard and his wife boarded a ship to Buenos Aires, Argentina. Rickard said, "I am through with the business of prize fighting, as there isn't anything in it. I don't like prize fighting anyway. I'm a frontierman. I like new things. I am going down to Argentina to look over the arrangements there. It is not unlikely that I shall go into the beef and sheep raising business in the Republic. I shall also look into the mining properties. Buenos Aires looks good to me. It has an export trade exceeding that of San Francisco by several $1 million yearly, a fact that very few people seem to be acquainted with, but one which appeals to me." When asked if he would be back promoting again at any point, he answered, "I don't consider that a dozen years would hold any event in that line big enough to warrant my consideration." He explained, "You know that after you have been mixed up in a big affair, the bouts which are being run in this country now seem very small in comparison. I cannot foresee any event of the near future that would warrant my attention after this big affair, and therefore I have put that kind of business out of my mind. I will not touch anything of that character again. I have been from time to time interested in mining, but I find this pretty risky and consider my first love, the cattle business, the best proposition." So he's leaving boxing for good, so he says. The couple spent 6 months in South America before returning to New York, but they were inquiring about land in Paraguay in South America. Very little was reported about Tex Rickard's life during these years, but a friend from his Klondike days did ask Tex on his return to New York why on earth he'd want to go to Paraguay.
The perplexed Albert Fink inquired, "But South America? Why South America of all places in the world? You've just made a tremendous success of that fight. Why not stay here and cash in on it with other promotions?" Rickard replied, "No thanks, Al. I've had all of that I want for quite some time. They've shoved me around to last me a lifetime. I'm going to put my money into something that don't depend on politicians." After arriving in Buenos Aires, Rickard convinced the Paraguayan government to give him control of 270,000 acres of land for a cattle business. During his first year in the South American cattle business, Rickard was busy travelling from South America to London and New York looking for investments. He found one in the Farquhar Syndicate of London, who controlled more than 5 million acres of the South American land. He then sent for about a dozen Texas cowboys to help set up and supervise operations on the massive spread. Many of those cowboys stayed in the area long after Rickard left. Although busy with his new business, Tex couldn't leave boxing alone, and it was reported that in September of 1911, Rickard established an athletic club in Buenos Aires for the purpose of promoting a title fight. The article read, "Tex Rickard has been heard from again. The man who promoted the Jeffries Johnson, Nelson Gans, and a few other equally important battles is now in South America, and he has made an offer of a purse of $40,000 for a finish bout between Wildest and Matt Wells, the English lightweight champion." After attempting to get back into the boxing world, Rickard travelled to London before returning to New York, where he remained until December of 1911. With Rickard now back in the news, reporters were eager to find out his thoughts on the current heavyweight scene.
Rickard correctly called it right. Don't let anybody tell you Jack Johnson is a back number and that any of the white hopes can whip him. There are only two men in the world who would have a chance with him now, and that's Sam Langford and Joe Jeanette. And boy, did he have it right, absolutely. By August of 1912, Rickard and his wife were living at the Savoy Hotel in London, in England. By 1913, the cattle business in South America fell into a political disagreement with the land Rickard and his associates in London had acquired. There was a dispute over boundary lines among the governments of Bolivia, Paraguay, Argentina and Brazil. The crisis reached boiling point when soldiers from Bolivia were actually sent to the disputed grounds and killed two of Rickard's men in land battles. Rickard returned and fought for his ranch land with his men by his side. In June 1913, newspapers reported that Rickard and his cowmen continued to remain in possession and probably will continue to do so until some agreement or settlement is reached by the four contending countries. Rickard explained the situation jokingly about how he lost a chance to promote the biggest fight of his career, the war between Bolivia and Paraguay. Rickard was travelling by train in an attempt to actually cross the boundary between Paraguay and Argentina, and he explained what happened next. He said, "Well, as soon as we got into Paraguay, we came across a lot of forts all filled with Bolivians. The Bolivian soldiers said that if we didn't turn back, they'd shoot us. Well, we thought we'd better go around. So we came out again and went south through the Argentine to Asunción and into Paraguay across the eastern boundary, the Paraguay River. When we got there, we told them how there were a lot of civilians sitting in forts in the middle of Paraguay, and that vexed them a bit. It was the first they'd heard of it."
Rickard continued, and he said, "Anyway, they all came around to me, the president, the cabinet, and everyone, and they told me that if I'd go out and fight the Bolivians, they'd give me all the soldiers I wanted and more. They'd give me an army. In fact, well, I didn't like to act without instruction, so I wired my people in Buenos Aires, and they cabled to Mr. Farquhar in Paris. He didn't want a war. He had too many big interests. He had too much at stake, and so I missed my chance to lead an army." Rickard may have not got the army, but he did give former US President Teddy Roosevelt the grand tour of the enormous land he was managing. The visit was probably more to do with keeping tabs on the Germans, who had acquired potential allies of all the countries south of the Texas border, Paraguay in particular. Rickard also showed some of those impressive negotiation skills he had learned as a youngster when facing the native Indians in America. Roosevelt wrote, "The Indian of the Chaco, a pure savage, a bow-bearing savage, will never come east of the Paraguay, and the Paraguayan is only beginning to venture into the western interior, away from the banks of the river, under the lead of pioneer settlers like Rickard, whom, by the way, the wild Indians thoroughly trust." By 1914 and early 1915, the situation in South America had turned bleak, so Rickard returned to New York, to the music and bad press he had received as a result of the political conflicts and World War I in general, which was now in its full swing. His closely guarded comments to the press were, "Paraguay has not been at all hurt by the war, and since the war there's practically been no change."
In the end, Rickard's losses amounted to about $1 million due to the Farquhar syndicate having financial difficulties. Therefore, the cattle business in South America was left behind. And it was basically time to scratch that itch and return to boxing promotion, or it was forced him back to boxing promotion. There was also another business venture that Rickard was eager to pursue, and that was the hope of taking over Madison Square Garden in 1916, and the lure was enough for Tex to come back to his home permanently. So as Tex Rickard stepped off the boat and smelled the air, apparently the press quoted him as saying, "I don't see how I managed to keep away so long." It wasn't until Rickard and his wife returned from South America that he learned that Jess Willard had actually beaten Jack Johnson in Havana, Cuba. Rickard was quite surprised by the news. He said, "I didn't even know they were gonna fight in Havana. It was my understanding that the fight was going to be taking place in Mexico. I saw Johnson in Buenos Aires only 2 months ago, and that was the last I heard of him until 3 o'clock this morning. As for Willard beating him, I don't know how to figure it out. When I saw Johnson in Argentina, he looked as good as ever. I believe it can only be explained by Willard's being a wonderful boy." Well, the day after his return home, Tex bumped into Tad Dorgan, the newsman and cartoonist who worked for the Hearst newspapers. This is how their meeting went. "Mr. Rickard, I'm Tad Dorgan." Rickard recalled his cartoon-like drawings printed in the newspapers at the time and said, "Oh, you're the one who draws those funny pictures." And Tad replied, "This is certainly a lucky meeting for me. I heard you were back from South America yesterday, and I was hoping to get to talk to you."
Tad then said, "I know you didn't come back here for your health. You must have a good reason to leave all those cattle ranches." Rickard replied and said, "I do have a good reason, right here in my coat pocket." Dorgan assumed, "You've signed up Frank Moran and Jess Willard?" Rickard pulled out a small box from his coat pocket and opened it carefully. "No, I've brought back some specimens from South America. I was on my way to giving them to my friends at the museum, but thanks for the tip," he told Dorgan. Tad later recalled from this meeting how Rickard had tricked him into giving him the scoop, and Rickard did precisely what Tad Dorgan had thought he would do with the information he had inadvertently given to him. He promoted the first title defence of Jess Willard's heavyweight reign 9 months after he beat Jack Johnson. Arrangements had already been made for a Willard fight with Frank Moran and were supposed to be promoted by Tommy Burns in New Orleans, but the fight promotion fell apart. Rickard would pick up the pieces by forming another partnership with Samuel McCracken, manager of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. The duo offered $40,000 to Willard, who accepted, and Frank Moran earned $23,750. New to the boxing promotions in New York, Rickard got stung financially. Every politician wanted a piece of the action in terms of kickbacks or handouts, and the cost for renting Madison Square Garden, his desired venue, was normally $1,000 per night. However, Jimmy Johnston, manager of the Garden, ended up charging Rickard almost $15,000 for the use of the place. The reason for this was Johnston was still fuming about losing the fight, so took his anger out financially on Rickard. Another lesson would be learned, but he would get his own back sooner rather than later.
The Sharks of New York, eh? And they're going to get worse. Well, a record number attended the no decision bout because in 1916, decision bouts were actually illegal in New York. This fight, refereed by Charlie White, went 10 rounds and Willard received a newspaper decision over Moran. The wealthy attendance and gate receipts of $152,000, Rickard's profit would be $30,000, would put him back into boxing promotion business for good. A good start for Rickard, but the fight was his worst promotion yet. Even John L. Sullivan had a pot. "Mr. Rickard, if that was a fight that I just saw, then I want to say that I challenge both the bums right now. Winner takes all." However, the old-timer would not get his opportunity, jokingly or not, because Madison Square Garden would not see another heavyweight title match for 4 years. The reason was by early 1917, America had entered the Great War. American ambassador to South America, Lieutenant John S. Hammond, contacted Rickard for help and asked if he could raise enough cattle to help alleviate the food shortage in Europe. Rickard was on the next boat to his ranch in Paraguay. Even though he had sold some of his land, he still owed more than 500 square miles in the disputed territory. He contacted British agents and proceeded to round up a herd of cattle and drive the herd to a port. However, Rickard could not get the cattle out of Paraguay. Paraguayan government officials would not release the cattle because there was an embargo and his cattle had been infected, so they said. Tex Rickard knew it was all a load of old bollocks. The cattle was healthy as ever, but to appease the agents, he returned to his ranch with the herd. He went to a second shipment, only to be turned away again. He was frustrated with all this political situation. He gave up and he returned back to the United States unsuccessful.
With Madison Square Garden failing to earn enough profit to meet the expenses, Rickard seized his opportunity to take over. An insurance company had now taken over the Garden on December the 8th, 1916, and entertained offers from potential renters. Rickard and Sam McCracken appeared to be the highest bidder in early November on a 5 to 10 year lease, but the pair would be disappointed when their offer was rejected. Instead, the contract went to W. Carmen Roberts, backed by the Ringling Circus, who then hired Grant Hugh Brown to oversee the management of the Garden. But after missing a second rental payment, they had to vacate the premises by March 1917. Another door had opened, and Rickard was quick to step in. On March the 15th, he submitted a note payable, a legal instrument in which one party promises in writing to pay a determinate sum of money to the other, to the life insurance company that explained he held 400 shares of the Northern Texas Oil Company that could be liquidated at any time. Rickard had loaned the Northern name to the company and his reputation as a major stockholder. The owner, J.C. Taylor, began to send Rickard payments on his stock sales, and Rickard saved that money along with McCracken's so he could lease Madison Square Garden. Unfortunately, the insurance company decided to take on management of the property themselves, which would limit the amount of fights at the Garden. But with the Great War in full swing, fighting was the last thing needed. Rickard would try again in a few more years. In November of 1918, Rickard received a call from Teddy Roosevelt's home. The former president was bedridden and gravely ill due to a viral infection he had contracted in Paraguay. Tex immediately went to Roosevelt's bedside, and he was delighted to see his cowboy friend once again.
He explained his condition. Some of the happiest days of my life lead to this. By George, Tex, I would like to be down there with you now. Rickard explained that his cowboy days were over, but Roosevelt said, "You'll go back someday perhaps, Tex, but who can tell about me?" Tex tried to reassure him. "You always were a good fighter, TR. You'll beat this." When the subject turned back to Roosevelt's condition, the nurse politely informed Rickard that it was time for his visit to end. Roosevelt reacted, "Why is it, Tex, that the moment anyone comes to see me that I really want to talk to, these nurses and doctors around here decide that they want to feed me or temperature me or something like that?" Tex took his hand, but his face had an expression on it and it dropped basically. He could tell that Roosevelt wasn't very well, and Roosevelt asked, "What's the matter, Tex? Do I look as badly as all that?" And Tex replied, "Get well quick, TR. I'm figuring on putting some big fights on now, the kind you'd enjoy." His eyes lit up. "Who are you going to try and match this time?" "I'm not sure, TR, but you're invited." "Goodbye, Tex. Thanks for remembering me. I hope the next time you see me, I'll be able to stand on my feet and shake hands with you like a man." Tex gripped his hand and said, "Sure you will." Unfortunately, that was the last time Rickard saw his mate. 2 months later, Theodore Roosevelt passed away. Rickard had lost 2 children, his first wife and now his good friend, plus he was struggling to get his foot up in New York. So he needed Lady Luck to shine on him once more. That came in the form of a young heavyweight who was making waves in the division, and who was managed by a kid who used to steal gold dust from the Northern Saloon.
The duo of Jack Dempsey, heavyweight contender, and Jack Doc Kearns, his manager, would take Tex Rickard's fortunes and theirs into another stratosphere. The two Jacks had been chasing the heavyweight champion, Jess Willard, all around the country and causing a real stir in the newspapers. We have done a Jack Dempsey career profile and a legendary night, The Tale of Dempsey Tunney. So if you want to hear more about Jack Dempsey's story and his interactions, of course, with Tex Rickard and Doc Kearns, please go and listen to those episodes. Kearns had travelled to New York to meet and convince Tex Rickard that Dempsey could not only be competitive against Willard, but that he could actually beat him. Rickard simply responded that Willard would kill him if they ever got in the ring, and he did not want to be responsible. He added, "The public will never go for that." And we explained in another episode that Kearns was the architect in getting the fight between Willard and Dempsey, but others have actually suggested that Rickard was already several steps ahead of him and aware that another promoter was considering the deal. Apparently Rickard was just giving Kearns the brush off until he was ready to make a deal. Ike Dorgan, Tad's brother and Rickard's press man, had given his buddy the scoop on a deal by this other promoter that would net Jess Willard $75,000 to fight Dempsey. It was Dorgan who first told Rickard to offer Willard $100,000 and not Doc Kearns, as Dempsey revealed in his book. The quote from him went like this: "I guess I convinced him, as in Rickard, when I told him I'd take care of raising the $100,000. The amount we figured that fat so-and-so, as in Willard, would accept as a guarantee. Ha! By the time I got through with him, he was convinced I knew what I was talking about." Also, according to Kearns, he quickly drafted a telegram to Willard on behalf of Rickard, and with Rickard's $20 bill, Kearns asked the waiter to send the telegram and keep the change.
2 days later, Willard responded, agreeing to the match, and met with Rickard, who successfully negotiated the deal with Willard. Tex then announced sometime after Toledo, Ohio was the fortunate local of the fight of the decade. Next, all parties met in New York to discuss the contract in front of the gathering press. Once again, we have been through this on the Jack Dempsey career profile and Legendary Nights episode, The Tale of Dempsey and Tunney. But after toing and throwing at the conference, Dempsey was actually guaranteed $27,500, the most money he had ever been offered and earned. Rickard proposed a new Army-Navy championship at the preliminary to the match, or to the fight. In February of 1919, Rickard paid $10,000 for the purse and proposed that an elimination tournament begin in order to narrow the field of men in both services at home and abroad. Rickard proposed to make the all-service match an acknowledged military title bout. Out of this tournament would emerge an unknown youngster named Gene Tunney. We did discuss this in Legendary Nights. We didn't mention this, so really great we could do that with this story. The lead up to the fight was amusing to Tex. His wife actually stated that he revelled in the Mardi Gras of injunction-waving reformers, settlement-seeking managers, rebellious referees, and blustering boxing commissions. Tickets were selling rapidly, and with the flow of money into the cash box came a myriad of itching palms eager for a share of the receipts, like sharks. Rickard built an 80,000-seat stadium, which cost $186,000, and reserved ringside seats were sold at $60. The cheapest seats were $10, standing room $2. The Dempsey-Willard fight in Toledo drew a disappointing number of slightly more than 20,000 people on July 4th, 1919. The heat was excruciating. By noon, the temperature had already passed the 100-degree mark. By fight time, some reporters called it 114 degrees in the shade. The presence of Rickard's Western friends and former lawmen increased the glamour of the spectacle. Bat Madison and Wyatt Earp showed up as self-appointed keepers of the peace.
They posted themselves at the entrance to the stadium and disarmed men and women, taking their knives and guns. When some refused to hand over the weapons, they actually used brute force, like only they knew how. They now kept order outside the stadium, rather than on the wild frontier. It marked a transition from the days of the Wild West to the Roaring Twenties. Inside the arena, Marines kept guard over the ring. They were positioned 2 rows behind the reporters and shorthand typists, and Tex Rickard, one of the judges, took his seat at ringside. Now, we've been through this fight a few times, so in short, Dempsey floored Willard 7 times in the opener that lasted just 2 minutes and 50 seconds. After the 7th knockdown, Dempsey left the ring with Kearns, celebrating, thinking they had won. But they were called back, or they would have been disqualified. And Dempsey again recalled that moment when he said, "I'd been champion for less than a minute and I had no idea what it felt like. All I knew was that I was once more the contender and that Doc had lost his belt." Willard stayed on his feet during rounds 2 and 3, but his corner had seen enough by then and decided to stop the fight after the 3rd round. Leaving Willard sat in his corner sobbing the same sentence, "I have $100,000 and a farm in Kansas." Now, Dempsey described his joyous moment. I won, my God, I won, I made it. I was the new champion." Although not the $1 million he had hoped for, Rickard totaled the gate earnings up to $452,000. After expenses, Rickard and his financial partner, Frank Flournoy, made about $100,000. Tex Rickard would promote 7 major fights with Dempsey, all but 2 of his fights for the title.
So in 1920, Rickard found it hard to find anyone worthy to fight the new heavyweight champion for the huge payday he had in mind. Doc Kearns grew frustrated by what he thought was Rickard's lack of effort and decided to go out on his own to promote Dempsey's next fight. The champ earned $55,000 and knew this was less money than he would have earned if he had fought under a promoted Rickard fight. But Dempsey was loyal, and Minsk was his friend. That was the guy he fought. And he felt that he owed his friend a title fight, so that's why he took the fight. He won it, obviously. By now, Rickard hated Kearns as well. Their feeling was also mutual. They were at each other. Kearns called Rickard a crafty son of a bitch, and Rickard called Kearns a cheap conniver who has no heartbeat and no blood. Rickard actually warned Dempsey. He said, "You must make sure he doesn't do to you what comes naturally to him." Dempsey was caught in the middle, and he was loyal to both. He said this of Tex: he was his own man, a lone, sensitive man, who didn't want to be obligated to anyone. Dempsey asked for Rickard's advice when a certain mafia boss, Chicago mafia boss, Al Capone, offered him any amount of money to appear on behalf at his private club in an exhibition match, boxing exhibition match. Rickard explained to Dempsey, "Jack, those gangster fellas are nice guys, most of them. You're going to have to meet more and more in this business. Be nice to them, polite, but don't never have no business with them. When they own you, they don't let you go. And tell that noisy manager of yours the same thing." Well, with Rickard's advice, Dempsey politely refused Capone's offer, but sent a signed autograph photo of himself. Capone remained a loyal fan of Jack Dempsey throughout his life.
When it came to the mob and Tex Rickard, Dempsey said that those guys never pulled the wool over his eyes and said he wasn't even impressed by them. He had seen tougher bums for 35 years. Some of them tougher than anything that New York had ever produced. By 1920, just when New York was about to become more lax with the law on boxing and began to sanction the sport, Madison Square Garden was scheduled to close. The New York Life Insurance Company planned to tear down the building and use the space for its own new high-rise office building. Sports promoters, managers, and New Yorkers in general were mortified at the thought of the landmark's destruction. But Tex seized the opportunity to become a full-time boxing promoter by coming to the building's rescue and offering the insurance executives a lease for the property that they could not refuse. As explained by Colleen Aycock and Mark Scott from Rickard in his book again, Tex Rickard, Boxing's Greatest Promoter, they said Rickard, the poker-faced gambler with a hefty bet, had the attention of the Garden executives when he proposed a lease amount backed by 2 imaginative plans: an entire boxing season of Friday night fights, followed by a summer swim season. His weekly boxing events would include title fights in all divisions. He said he could bring not just some, but all of the world's greatest indoor boxers to Madison Square Garden. Bouts would rival and exceed those taking place in the Great Club of London and would begin as soon as state boxing licenses could be acquired. The owners of Madison Square Garden had him sign on the dotted line. Rickard leased the building on July the 12th, 1920 for $300,000 a year for 10 years. Backing his lease with a sublease was his partner in the venture, John Ringling, the circus organiser and mainstay of the Garden.
Yeah, he was the guy that all the circus events went through. All the elephants and stuff used to go there. It's pictures of the elephants outside Madison Square Garden. Rickard's first card and the first main event for legal boxing under New York's new law would be at the Garden on September the 17th. Rickard's plan for the Garden included remodelling the structure, adding seating capacity, bringing it up to 13,000 seats, and turning the giant arena into the world's largest indoor swimming pool during the summer months. He estimated that the pool revenue would make the overall Madison Square Garden operations profitable when boxing matches could not be held indoors. His plans proved true. Rickard became the first boxing promoter and manager of the Garden to make the facility profitable. Within 5 months, the Garden brought in over $1 million. True to his word, Rickard accomplished this extraordinary feat by maintaining a steady weekly supply of boxing events that attracted the public in large numbers. He earned the Garden a total of $1 million in earnings in months, with a total attendance of 275,000. In his first season of boxing, Rickard promoted an amazing 100 fights, which included a string of successful title fights. As promised, in the summer months, a swimming pool. The New York Tribune reported this amazing thing. It's incredible for the times as well. So this is what it said, New York Tribune. Once more, New York has added to its fame as the one place where things are done on a big scale, thanks to Tex Rickard's latest enterprise, the world's largest and most elaborate swimming pool under the great dome of Madison Square Garden. It surpasses anything ever before attempted for the benefit of sweltering New Yorkers. Its popularity has surpassed all estimates. Rickard accomplished this massive indoor construction project while he was planning for his giant outdoor event, the Dempsey Carpenter fight in New Jersey. However, it was the Garden's successful swimming pool that landed him in some serious hot water when several of the female swimmers would accuse him of sexual misconduct.
Rickard next promoted Dempsey's title defence against Bill Brennan at Madison Square Garden on December 14, 1920. Jack Kearns threw a spanner in the works when he demanded, after the contract had been signed, that Rickard give him 500 ringside seats. These were tickets Kearns intended to give to Mike Jacobs for ticket resale, or else Dempsey would sprain an ankle, as he said. Rickard ended up giving Jacobs more than 300 premium tickets. The fight was scheduled for 15 rounds, and surprisingly, Brennan almost beat Dempsey, but he was able to hang in there to get the 12th round knockout. Dempsey actually recalled years later, aside from my second bout with Gene Tunney, this bout with Brennan was just about the most closely contested fight I ever had. Rickard paid Brennan $30,000 and Dempsey $50,000. The vulnerabilities that Dempsey showed in the first and the fact that many still perceived him as a slacker was the perfect angle for Tex to wave his magic wand and follow up with a massive promotion against a guy that could beat him. The perfect opponent was a French war hero, a former fighter pilot, the French NYSAC and World Light Heavyweight Champion, Georges Carpentier. The angle was simple, but hugely successful. The war hero against Jack Dempsey. The slacker who had just been to trial for draft evasion. The fact that he was acquitted didn't matter. Some would say, there's no smoke without fire. The contract was signed by all parties, with the promoters offering a guarantee of $500,000 and the managers each offered $50,000 in fight forfeits. It was all going swimmingly, until Charles Cochrane, an English promoter, and William Brady, the third member of the promotion team that included Tex, decided to withdraw. Rickard was now left to pay the whole $500,000 fee on his own.
So what did he do? He first turned to Uncle Mike of all people, Mike Jacobs, promising him choice seats in advance. Jacobs went on to raise $180,000 in cash. Rickard never forgot this act, and for the rest of his promotional days made a point of offering Jacobs choice seats for every fight, a gesture that he would be seen later as scandalous ticket conspiracy, apparently, and unethical operating procedures. Well, his silent partner, John Ringling, actually helped him attain the rest along with his own stake. So the fight was back on. When pressure from New Yorkers prevented Rickard from staging a match in New York, he leased a site in New Jersey known as Boyle's 30 Acres. Rickard began work on the massive stadium. Originally designed to hold 50,000, the outdoor arena was redesigned to accommodate 70,000 and then expanded again to hold 90,000. This boxing event marked another significant moment in history. It was the first time a world title match, or any large event for that matter, had been transmitted over the radio or relayed to the masses, and it was by Supervox. 90,000 people paid a total of $1.6 million to watch the fight. 3,000 miles away, 10,000 San Franciscans gathered on Market and 3rd Streets to hear the round-by-round telegraph returns in another history-making event surrounding boxing. The who's who was also in attendance. That even impressed Rickard. And before the fight, Rickard visited Jack Dempsey's dressing room, and he said, "You've never seen anything like it." He couldn't believe it himself. He then turned to Kearns and Dempsey and said, "Now don't mess it up." "What do you mean don't mess it up?" Dempsey asked. "This is just the beginning, and I hope you guys don't mess it up." Rickard continued, "Listen, Jack, take it easy on Carpenter. Give the people out there a good run for their money, but be careful. Don't kill him. Don't kill everything."
In the opening round, Carpenter let fly a right to the face, a solid left hook, and a booming overhand right which has Dempsey reeling back. The Frenchman took the first, but then broke his hand in the second and withered under Dempsey's heavy blows. Carpenter gave his version on the best round, and he said, "In the 3rd round, I believe I outboxed Dempsey, except in the clinches. But what was the use? He took everything I had for the sake of hitting me. He hurt me badly, and with my broken hand, I could not hold him off. I was determined to stay as long as possible. His body blows weakened me, and I kept on running. A hard left to the jaw staggered me, and I knew Dempsey was letting me hit him in order to get in his own punches." In round 4, the Frenchman quickly let fly a right to Dempsey's face, followed by a blazing left hook and a booming overhand right. Dempsey once more stumbled back. Finally, Dempsey, after taking one, landed a left to the heart and a thudding right to the temple that put Carpenter down. Amazingly, Carpenter got back up at the count of 6, but he was sent down to the canvas in what he said was the hardest blow he had ever felt, just over his heart. After that blow, Carpenter said that he never heard the count of 10. He had to be carried back to his corner. Dempsey retained the world title. Carpenter told the press afterwards, "I have failed in my life's ambition and can only say that I honestly believe a better man won." After earning the fortune and recognition for promoting the first $1 million gate, Rickard spent much of the early part of 1922 in court.
He did, and it all started with a guy called Frank C. Armstrong, a New York boxing promoter, who sued Rickard for a share of his recent income from the Garden's operations. Armstrong actually alleged that he and Rickard had agreed to partner in the promotion of fights at the Garden. Rickard's assets were frozen, and John Ringling, vice president of Garden operations, replaced Rickard temporarily as president. In February, the state Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiff Armstrong. Rickard appealed, and the court then decided in Rickard's favor that no partnership had ever existed between the two parties. Rickard was then restored to his full management duties at the Garden, but Armstrong continued with lawsuits against him throughout his whole lifetime. In fact, Armstrong was still trying to recover the funds after poor Tex Rickard died when he sued Rickard's estate. Well, in the book, Tex Rickard's Greatest Boxing Promoter, we keep highlighting it because it was a great source for this great episode. They explained why he was back in court again. And so, this time, due to allegations, we did mention it earlier, made by 3 young girls, ages 11, 12 and 15. The oldest girl said that Rickard had sexual relations with her and that the sordid affair had lasted a period of months. He was put on trial for abduction and assault in the 2nd degree of 15-year-old Sarah Schoenfield. Rickard's connection with the girl was complicated. Now, according to her courtroom testimony, she had first met Rickard at Madison Square Garden swimming pool the previous September. She had been introduced to him by a 12-year-old friend. She also said that she had visited his Garden Tower office and an apartment on West 47th Street. As proof of her knowledge of him, she stated that he carried a revolver, wore a badge, and was some kind of police commissioner. Every time she saw him, Rickard would ask how she was getting on along at school and asked about her mother.
At one point, the girl explained that her brother had been jailed and that her mother had asked her to seek Rickard's help in the matter. Rickard told her he would do what he could to help out. With the knowledge that her daughter was acquainted with the politically connected and powerful promoter, the girl's mother appealed to Rickard in January to write a letter on behalf of her son, who was jailed in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for robbery. Rickard did help the family. On January the 22nd, he had written, "I enclose herewith a letter which I have signed and you can send to the governor of Wisconsin. It says I will bring the boy here, give him medical attention and put him to work. I hope you will succeed in getting him released and that my letter will have some influence with the governor. Explain in your letter to the governor just where the boy is and all the facts regarding his arrest, the name of the warden, etc. I think that the letter direct from you to the governor will have no more effect with my letter enclosed than by my approaching the governor direct." In return for his help, Rickard had to answer charges against him that included assault and statutory rape. 6 girls were held as material witnesses to the assault. Rickard was jailed beginning March the 20th, 1922, in the infamous Tombs of New York. On February the 16th, 1922, a grand jury returned 2 indictments against Tex Rickard, charging him with assaulting 2 girls. He pleaded not guilty before a Supreme Court and was released pending trial on a $10,000 bail. The next day, Rickard was, for a second time, removed from active management of his business, but this time he would also lose his promoter's license.
The State Athletic Commission gave their ultimatum to the Garden's owners. Unless they got rid of Tex Rickard as manager, the Garden would lose its boxing venue. And then carried on from the book again with the more details with these sexual assault claims. Now, many of Rickard's friends were either questioned as suspected witnesses to the crime or brought in as character witnesses. Rickard's good friend, Walter Fields, brother of actor W.C. Fields, had rented the apartment where some of the crimes with Rickard were said to have taken place, and the judge questioned why he was mysteriously missing from New York during the trial. Then at the trial, Rickard's lawyer, Max Stewart, asserted that Rickard was a victim of Wall Street blackmailers. He did not elaborate, but promised that Rickard would hunt them down. His lawyer then emphasized Rickard's whereabouts. On January 23rd, the day he was supposed to be riding in his automobile with his girls, attorney Stewart told the judge he was in my room in my house. Now, if the attorney and client were lying about the matter, the attorney stood to lose his license. He made that clear to everyone in court. Kermit Roosevelt, son of the former president, who also testified that Rickard was at the Dartmouth, Pennsylvania football game on one of the days in question. The problem was that Rickard could not remember anything about the game that was played. Nevertheless, Rickard could provide alibis for the times in question. The writer, the author of each, explained that the episode reeked of a shakedown. He said, "I considered it a deliberate frame by the mob which had controlled boxing and which was bent upon smashing him before he could smash them." Rickard, at one point before the trial, was told at a restaurant that the charges would be dropped in return of a handsome payoff.
After deliberating an hour and a half, the jury found the defendant not guilty. The Jack Dempsey biographer, Randy Roberts, noted a source that said Rickard gripped the rail and almost fell to his knees in emotion. The courtroom then erupted into a frenzy of cheering, hand-clapping and handshaking. Rickard's relief was palpable. "This is the happiest day of my life." Although the charges were probably a fabrication, in later years others would claim that Rickard had always liked very young women. So, yet again, you can determine yourself from that information and the sources we've put together for this episode. Do you really think he was that sort of a person? Well, he was not proven guilty for it. Again, there's no smoke without fire though. And Beach explained it, and he said, "That experience changed him in some way, too subtle for me to analyse. He never referred to it, but I saw indications that it had left its mark and that he had grown more wary." Now, after being ridiculed by the press in a ruthless manner, it eventually died down after about a year and a big charity promotion. But when Rickard's personal ordeal was over, he got back to promoting a fight which involved the former heavyweight champion Jess Willard against contender Louis Firpo in an elimination fight, with the winner to fight Dempsey at Boyle's 30 Acres in New Jersey on July the 12th, 1923. Rickard dubbed it the Battle of the Giants. Willard was knocked out in 8 rounds in front of 82,000 people, and the big Argentinian was in line for a world title fight. Willard received $185,000 and Firpo $110,000, and Rickard had promoted another heavyweight fight that drew $1 million gate. Rickard offered Dempsey $300,000 to fight Firpo, but Kearns refused and demanded $500,000. Rickard agreed. Before the bout at the Polo Grounds in New York City on September the 14th, 1923, Tex, once again, entered Dempsey's dressing room and said, "If you put him away with the first punch, all those people out there won't get their money's worth."
Dempsey replied, "Listen, Tex, there's one difference between this guy and Carpentier. Firpo is bigger and a slugger. He could kill me with one wallop." Rickard countered, "But Jack, how is he going to hit you? He's slow and moves like an old tub. I'd hate to think of all them nice millionaires going out of here sore at the both of us." Well, the fans received a great show for their ticket money. Even though the fight lasted only 1 round and 57 seconds of the second, it was the most viciously fought 4 minutes in boxing history. In the first round, Firpo went down 7 times and Dempsey twice. The second time, he was actually knocked out of the ring. Eventually, the Argentine was knocked out in the second after being put down for good for the 9th time, and Dempsey retained his title. He wouldn't defend it again now for 3 years. While Dempsey enjoyed the fruits of his labour, the Garden continued to flourish under Tex Rickard, with the traditional circus, rodeos, bicycle races, horse shows and boxing, of course. Attendance averaged 3 million people per year. After the success of Rickard's charity promotion featuring New York's popular Benny Leonard and Richie Mitchell for the lightweight title, another charity approached the now established promoter. The first charity bout was so popular that it raised more than $75,000 for Ann Morgan's relief efforts. This encouraged Mrs. William Randolph Hearst to seek a similar fundraiser in 1923. She asked Rickard to arrange a bout that would be called the greatest of all charity affairs, with the proceeds going to the aid the Free Milk Fund for New York's underfed children. Rickard believed that with her support that he could stage an even bigger event, and so became the first promoter to stage a boxing card at the Yankee Stadium called the Heavyweight Carnival on May the 12th, 1923.
The card featured Jess Willard stopping Floyd Johnson in the 11th round, Fred Fulton getting disqualified in the 4th against Jim Herman, and Luis Angel Firpo knocking out Jack McLuffy II in the 3rd round. Attendance totaled 63,000, and minus expenses, Mrs. Hearst Charity collected over $182,000. Now, even though the Garden was continuing to flourish, in May, Rickard and Ringling, who were only 4 years into their 10-year lease, were notified that their time at Madison Square Garden was over. He and his partner were given 1 year from May 1924 to May 1925 in which to vacate the old building. In June, a representative from New York Life filed architectural plans with the city to replace the Garden with the company's proposed high-rise office complex. The public was outraged, but they could do nothing to stop the demolition. Accepting the inevitable, New Yorkers spent the next year trying to save the now famous statue of Diana, designed by St. Gaudens, notable in that when the naked effigy was originally proposed, many New Yorkers had mixed feelings about it. Now it was viewed as a city treasure. While the Garden was awaiting its fate, for the first time in history, Rickard ranked fighters according to their weight categories. He established 9 categories and listed the top 10 international boxers according to a ranking based on his opinion. Rickard was now a well-respected expert on the sport, not only in America, but also in other parts of the boxing world. His ranking was expected to be published in a new magazine called The Ring, edited by Nat Fleischer. Rickard's list of rankings was published in the February issue, and it was the first world ranking of boxers, and all selections were made by Tex Rickard.
The farewell battle in the old Madison Square Garden took place on May 5th, 1925, and the main bout between lightweights Johnny Dundee and Sid Terrace was not a crowd pleaser, but most of the packed house of 10,105 came for sentimental reasons. Many current and former boxers, managers, trainers, promoters, politicians, sports writers and commissioners attended, and they all said they were there to see the fight, but really, we all know they were there to say goodbye to the old place. The next day, the statue of Diana was scheduled to be taken down from the tower. In 1925, under Root's Committee to Save Diana, the statue was donated by Darwin P. Kingsley, president of the New York Life, to the University of New York, although it never arrived, and is currently located in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. If you didn't know and you want to see it, there it is. Now, with the old garden gone, Rickard had already began planning to build a new landmark entertainment complex that was even larger than the original. Tex Rickard's promotional success was good for boxing, but too many felt that he was starting to dominate the sport. Other promoters, arena owners and fight managers were not happy, as were the politicians who used the anti-film law as a loophole to ruin Rickard's reign. Amid great publicity, Rickard was tried, convicted and forced to pay a fine, along with 5 co-defendants in Trenton, New Jersey, for, and this is quoted, conspiracy to violate the interstate commerce law by illegally transporting films of the Dempsey Carpenter fight, the fight for which the film was made 4 years earlier. This didn't stop Tex Rickard. It was just another minor setback while his garden development was coming along rapidly. The initial cost of materials and construction of the building was estimated at $5.5 million, although some reported costs went as high as $18 million, which were financed by a syndicate of Wall Street bankers.
Rickard managed to gather together what he called his 600 millionaires to fund a business called the New Madison Square Garden Corporation, which was headed by Alan A. Week and Company. The corporation opened sale of its stock to the public, advancing $1 million of stock at $20 per share in order to bring in revenues for the immense building project. Rickard was granted a 20-year lease and an annual salary of $30,000 to run Madison Square Garden. In the midst of the new garden being built, Rickard tragically lost his wife, Edith May, who was already unwell when she contracted pneumonia. Tex was at her bedside when she suddenly passed away. Following the death of his wife, he needed the perfect distraction, which was, of course, making sure all of his efforts and undivided attention went in to the construction of the new Madison Square Garden. Now, work on the new MSG began in the autumn of 1924, and the official opening was on December the 15th, 1925. It was the largest indoor arena in existence to this point, depending upon the event, with capacity rising to 24,000. For its time, the place was a modern engineering marvel, designed by Tex Rickard. The ring was so luxurious that sportsmen said any boxer should be glad to be knocked out in it. The ring is surely the most luxurious of all rings since the beginning of fighting. The posts were solid brass, and the floor was made of cork, with a rubberized canvas laid on top. The 4 ring ropes were thick and wrapped in green velvet. To keep the revenue coming in, Rickard held an ice hockey game at the new garden, and it was a huge success, with the event selling out. Impressed, Rickard applied for his own team franchise, and in 1926, the National Hockey League granted him a franchise to operate. The sports writers dubbed the team New York's Tex Rangers, and Tex Rangers eventually became the New York Rangers.
Well, in just their second season, Texas Rangers won the Stanley Cup Series in Montreal. Everything he touched was now turning to gold, and week after week, the new garden turned out successful professional and amateur boxing events. The venue drew in 250,000 paid admissions in its first season of boxing, and Rickard proved that weekly indoor boxing events could more than pay for expenses. Trouble was, boxers wanted some of that Dempsey money and began sort of pricing themselves out of fights. The boxing commissioner got irritated with the lack of competitive fights, and Rickard was seen as the man at the top that could not be removed, and therefore he was resented by many. He was like a monopoly on his own. While the commissioners complained, rumours circled that Rickard was being persuaded to leave the garden that he had built. That was impossible. The garden had never been a more popular attraction or a more profitable operation. Since the first 2 years that Rickard's new Madison Square Garden operated, Rickard's fights alone, both indoor and outdoor fights, grossed $6.35 million. Between September the 1st, 1925 and August the 31st, 1927, the Gardens Corporation had earned a net profit of more than $1 million. What Tex wanted to promote now was Dempsey against Gene Tunney. So in 1925, he phoned Dempsey's new manager at the time. Dempsey had now split with Kearns. The manager was Teddy Hayes, to inquire on his fighter's physical condition because he had been out of the ring for so long. Hayes told Rickard, all he's been doing for 2 years, Tex, is climbing on top of that dame. Harry Wills was the man who should have fought Jack Dempsey. But in his last fight that was actually promoted by Tex Rickard against Furbo at Boyle's 30 Acres in New Jersey on September 11, 1924, it was a financial flop. Tex was actually accused of towing the colour line and being racist. But the truth is, he didn't want to lose money, and he was still scared from the aftermath of the Gans-Nelson and Johnson-Jeffrey fights.
Rickard did attempt to match up Wills and Tunney, but the match fell through because of finances, and the winner was supposed to fight Dempsey. Either way, Rickard was adamant on his next big fight and gave the New York Athletic Commissioners an ultimatum. Either they agreed to a Dempsey-Tunney, not a Dempsey-Wills match in New York, or he would take the fight elsewhere. They refused to bow down to his demands, so the Athletic Commission suspended his promoter's license in New York and then revoked Dempsey's boxing license. Rickard decided to take the fight to Pennsylvania, where the state was already planning to host a national event. The United States was commemorating its 150th year since the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, and this was the perfect location for the fight. The buildings for a large public exhibition had already been constructed, and the Philadelphia Stadium was a perfect setting for another Rickard boxing bill named the Battle of the Century. Now, we have been through this fight in the tale of Dempsey versus Tunney, so please do go check it out. But in summary, Dempsey, he was always too dangerous and showed great heart, but having been so inactive, Tunney was just too slick for the aging heavyweight, and he took a 10-round decision and the World Heavyweight title on September the 23rd, 1926. The New York Times estimated the crowd at 135,000 people, calling the bout the biggest event in the history of sport. It was boxing's and Rickard's third $1 million gate, bringing in over $1.8 million. Dempsey's purse was $770,000 and Tunney's was $200,000. Now, a month after the fight, Rickard, 33 years older than Maxine Elliott Hodges, then 23, got married on October the 7th, 1926 in Louisburg. They had a daughter together, Maxine Texas Rickard. She was born on June 7th, 1927 in New York. Sadly, he only had a short time to enjoy his new marriage and bond with his new daughter.
So after Dempsey lost to Tunney, Rickard, who didn't like immediate rematches, told the former champ, "I'm going to match you against Jack Sharkey, the winner to fight Tunney." Dempsey knocked out Sharkey on July the 21st, 1927 at the Yankee Stadium in the Bronx with a left hook in the 7th round. The fight grossed over $1 million and Dempsey earned half of it. It was Rickard's fourth $1 million gate. Years later, after the Tunney fights, Dempsey would say this of Tex Rickard: "At the time I was fighting, we had a man named Rickard who was a great promoter and a good man, and everybody got paid exactly what that contract called for. That's what made the fight game good." When the second Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney fight came round on September the 22nd, 1927 at Soldiers Field in Chicago, Illinois, there was more trash talk than in the first. This was music to Rickard's ears, who apparently turned to his wife and said, "Now they're hating each other. I think I'll have some more tickets printed." So before the fight, Al Capone popped up again. He must have read about the needle between the pair, so he wrote to Dempsey, wrote him a letter, and in no uncertain terms, he explained that he could make sure that, this is in quotes, the real champ won in Chicago. Big Al considered Tunney a fucking pansy, apparently. When Dempsey received Capone's offer, he graciously declined, invoking sportsmanship. Capone sent a truckload of flowers to Dempsey's training camp, along with a note reading, "In the name of sportsmanship." For the rematch, the gate receipts were greater than the first fight, making Dempsey Tunney 2 the first $2 million gate bout in history, and making Tunney the first boxer to earn more than $1 million for one fight. Tunney's percentage of the gate didn't quite make $1 million, so Tunney wrote a personal check to Tex Rickard for $9,554.46. Then Tex handed him a check for $1 million.
Now, we have been through their famous long count fight in our Legendary Nights episode, so again, we always allude to them episodes. If you want to go back and listen further to that, please do go and check it out. So again, in summary, Dempsey scored a knockdown in round 7, but the referee Dave Barry, to some people's opinion, gave a slow count, which allowed Tunney enough time to recover his senses and fight on. Dempsey would be down himself in the next round, upon which the referee immediately began the count, unlike when Tunney was knocked down. This time, the referee ignored the neutral corner rule, which he had so diligently enforced when it had been Tunney on the canvas. There was speculation later that Dave Barry had favoured Tunney, and that he may have been paid off. It's the inconsistency of Mr. Barry from one round to the next that has brought this fight into disrepute. Now, a crowd of over 104,000 people produced a gate of $2.8 million and Rickard's fifth $1 million gate. As a result, Rickard was given exclusive rights to both Yankee Stadium in New York and Boyle's 30 Acres in New Jersey. Earnings from the first half of 1927 indicated a gross of over $2.5 million against the previous full year's gross earnings of $5.5 million. Operating income after general expenses totaled over $763,000 against $1.4 million. The net income after taxes for the two periods was around about $500,000 and over $700,000. Now, even though they were in prohibition at the time, Rickard was wealthy enough to celebrate with alcohol. In fact, Rickard had his own private stock of wine, as did everyone else with the means to do so. Tex Rickard's last heavyweight title fight promotion, he wasn't the most successful, as he actually struggled to get anyone interested in the Gene Tunney against Tom Heaney bout on July the 26th, 1928 at the Yankee Stadium in New York. In fact, this was one fight that we completely missed out of our Legendary Nights episode because it really did feel so insignificant that it was something we completely overlooked. But Tex Rickard, of course, for those reasons, also wasn't able to sell the fight. So, quite evidently, it wasn't as significant as his previous two.
It wasn't. We completely missed it. I thought it was he retired after because it's pointless. Well, we'll go into it because around this time, Rickard was asked if he was actually planning to buy the New York Giants baseball team, and he replied, "It is true that such a deal is in the fire, and I would not be surprised if the announcement would be made any time or any day soon." And however, it's just a misleading thing. It was an attempt to add value to a very uninteresting Tunney fight. The New York Giants were a national institution and were not for sale, but he had to stir up some kind of controversy because there was nothing between the fighters, and just the fight, even though it didn't even relate to the fight was just a predictable and uneventful in the build-up, which Tunney went on to win by an 11th round stoppage. That would be Tunney's last professional fight and Rickard's last big fight. The papers wrote that Tex Rickard lost his golden touch at the Yankee Stadium last night, while the promoter admitted a loss of $100,000 on the title contest between Tunney and Heaney. Others close to the business end of the fight placed the figure close to $250,000. I mean, did it matter? Well, while Rickard was hoping to attract 88,000 seating capacity, the fight only drew 50. Gross receipts totaled just shy of 700,000, but after taxes, Tunney's payments of 625,000, and Heaney's payment of 100,000, the stadium rent, which was 50,000, put the promotion at a loss. The report was noted that there were as many police officers and firemen and ushers and other service attendants as there were paid patrons. Not to be put off by his foul promotion, Rickard built another indoor venue called the Boston Madison Square Garden, which opened with a fight between Vic Finnegan and Andre Rutes in 1928. Not only did boxing flourish at the Boston Gardens, it became famous in the 1980s when the Boston Celtics were on fire. Rickard spent the summer in Miami, where he had purchased a mansion with his young family.
He took up golf and bought a yacht. Rickard was winding down and enjoying the money, as described by Journal American when they wrote, "It's the beginning of the end for the most picturesque figure of modern times. It may not be this month, and it may not be this year, but the time is growing near. The lust for success has gone. The incentive has been removed. Tex is rich, richer than even a gambler could hope to be." After his little break, Rickard made Dempsey his 50-50 partner, and Dempsey explained, "He did me the honour of making me his partner. I was as proud of that as of anything in my life. Now there was his big hand shaking mine, and he was telling me I was his 50-50 partner until death. We never had a contract. You didn't need one with Tex Rickard. He was the great man of my life. He focused on taking boxing to Florida, while his enterprises in Miami were doing as well as anything he put his mind to. He built an outdoor stadium larger than any constructed to date, a racetrack and a casino to rival Monte Carlo. Not all belonged to him, of course. He's still working for the Garden Corporation, but he had stocks and shares in all sorts of pies. Rickard went to visit his friend, Bill Muldoon, at the office of the New York Athletic Commission, where he was told his friend was in bad health. Rickard tried to cheer up his mate and said, "Mr. Muldoon, come on down to Miami with me. It will add 5 years to your life." Muldoon politely declined. Muldoon's biographer said that Rickard was deeply upset over the way he had left Muldoon. From the commissioner's office, Rickard went back to Madison Square Garden and gave interviews to the newsmen about his new casino in Florida.
And he told the press that the new place would draw 500,000 and proved that Southern Florida would be the newest thing in the winter sport entertainment business. It was his last press conference, and his last words were not of the ballyhoo, but of his friend William Muldoon. "Poor old man," he said sadly to the newspaper boys before he left. "Be nice to Muldoon, boys. He hasn't got long to go." Rickard had planned to build another outdoor arena in Miami and have it host the first big outdoor boxing event of the year. But on New Year's Day 1929, he complained of stomach pains. He saw his doctor and rushed him to the Allison Hospital, where he was immediately operated to remove his appendix. The next morning, while still considered in critical condition, he seemed interested in the sports news, and everyone expected him to make a full recovery. By Friday, January 4, Rickard's condition worsened, and Mrs. Rickard was desperately searching for a second opinion about his medical condition. When Dempsey was allowed to finally see Rickard, the promoter told him, "Jack, I've got this fight licked." Once outside the hospital room, an excited Dempsey scrambled to find additional doctors to bring in to assess Rickard's condition. On Saturday, Dr. S.W. Fleming, Mrs. Rickard's personal New York physician, flew into Miami to consult with the attending physicians. After that consultation, he announced that Rickard's critical condition had essentially not changed. By 4 p.m. Saturday, another report on his condition was issued at the hospital. Mr. Rickard's condition is still critical. The patient is very toxic with a temperature of 103 and a pulse of 132. The outlook is grave, but not entirely hopeless. Mrs. Rickard requested that Dr. Will Mayo of the Mayo Brothers Clinic at Rochester, Minnesota, be called in to treat her husband, but the doctor was away attending a medical conference in Havana, Cuba.
One of Rickard's fight friends, a pilot, took off for Havana to convince the Rochester doctor to accompany him back to Miami to treat Rickard. But assessing the situation from Cuba, Dr. Mayo believed there was nothing he could possibly do that the existing doctors were not already doing. At midnight, Dr. E.H. Adkins, the attendant physician at the hospital, issued a statement. Practically the same condition existed tonight as this afternoon. Mr. Rickard's resistance was possibly slightly lower. His temperature remained at 103 and his pulse had increased from 132 at 4 p.m. to 140 at this time. 5 days after his operation, on Sunday morning, with his wife at his side, Tex Rickard passed away at 8:37 a.m., January the 6th, 1929. Now, Rickard had remained conscious until about 2 hours before his death. Before lapsing into a coma, he turned to his wife and friends at his bedside and said, "I'm getting a tough break, but I'll fight." Then he said to Maxine, "Help me over this, sweetheart. I'm fighting my..." And he never finished his sentence. The official death certificate signed by Dr. Adkins noted that Rickard's death resulted from an overwhelming infection following acute gangrenous appendicitis. Jack Dempsey was reported as saying, "I've lost the best pal I ever had." According to the Associated Press reports, when Dempsey left the room and sought the reception hall, he struggled to control his emotions, his face covered by a 2-day growth of beard. Dempsey choked as he said, "It must come to everyone, but it's mighty hard to see Tex go. We can only carry on as he would have done." Rickard's body was placed in a bronze casket, and Mrs. Rickard, who was Catholic, had Father William Barry provide local services for Tex in Miami. Afterwards, the heavy casket was transferred by hearse to a train car, which took Rickard's remains back to his home in New York.
So the body was actually accompanied by his wife, 2 of his best friends, Jack Dempsey and Walter Fields. So them 3. The casket was covered with a blanket of roses provided by Dempsey and Fields with a note that read simply, "To our pal." His body lie in state in New York at his temple, the monument, Madison Square Garden. A police escort of 100 waited to accompany the remains to Madison Square Garden. Hundreds of people stood silently about the Pennsylvania station gates. Men and women lined the streets along the route to the garden. The newspapers explained that because Rickard was a man of no particular religion, those in charge of his funeral services were seeking to have a priest, a rabbi, and a Protestant participate in the final rites. Rickard's body was carried into a huge tomb of a building and was attended through the night by 2 honor guards. The floodlights that normally illuminated the garden's boxing ring shone down on the promoter as he lay opposite his own private box, now draped in sober black. Surrounding the casket were huge palms and masses of floral tributes. After relatives and close friends were given time alone with the promoter, the doors of the sports palace were opened to the general public. In 3 hours, some 15,000 men, women and children passed by his casket in a single file to pay their last respects. Gene Tunney sent out his condolences and he said, "My sympathy goes out to Mr. Rickard's family. I feel his death keenly as one of my myriad of friends. The world of sport has undoubtedly lost a genius. There probably will never be another promoter so capable of stirring the public interest. It might truly be said that whatever his hands touched turned to gold."
In a New York Times article dated June 28, 1928, Tex Rickard is quoted as saying, "I am worth $2.5 million. I have $1 million in cash in New York banks. I keep that sum because I am always looking around for a good investment, some gilt-edged securities. And when it comes along, I want to be able to have the money ready to get in on it, so I can go to any good investment." 6 months later, the Times reported that most of his estate, valued somewhere between $1 to $3 million, would go to his 3-year-old daughter, Maxine Texas Rickard. The will was filed on January the 11th, and when the executor of the estate finally published a full accounting in 1932, the Journal American stated that Rickard heirs to receive less than $114,000. This article noted that the assets were listed blocks of stock in 53 different corporations, all of which were appraised as valueless, and it read there were almost as many personal notes on which he had loaned money between 1924 and 1929, and which became so much waste paper in the appraiser's eyes after Rickard's death. Jack Dempsey explained that Tex Rickard trusted everyone, the same old story of a man who had too much confidence in his friends. Rickard died 10 months before Black Friday, which signalled the crash of Wall Street and the coming depression. 9 months after his death, the shares for Rickard's beloved garden stock fell suddenly, along with the market of 1929. Everyone, including the 600 millionaires, suffered. Mike Jacobs took over Rickard's position as boxing's top promoter. However, Rickard's Madison Square Garden was closed in 1968. Boxing and ice hockey kept money flowing through the Garden during the Depression. During the depth of the Depression, the Rangers acquired another Stanley Cup victory in 1933.
It's sad with the finances there. The fact is he had so many, his hands are so many different pies that I think a lot of those guys when he died were like, no, we don't owe you no money, he's got no shares here. I do believe that probably happened, and that's why it seemed like he had less than he did. But to finish this off in numbers again, because it's a lot of number crunching here, and the numbers this guy made, it's insane. So this was given to Nat Fleischer. Rickard was reported to have paid Dempsey a total of $2.475259 figures. Showed that Rickard paid Dempsey $27,500 for the Willard fight, $100,000 for the Brennan fight, $300,000 for the Carpentier fight, $509,000 for the Firpo fight, $710,000 for the Tunney fight, $252,000 to fight Sharkey, and then the $450,000 for the Tunney fight in Chicago. Dempsey's film revenues were not included in those figures. Amazing, the amount of money they made back then, absolutely insane money. Finishing with a few quotes here, Jack Dempsey had his quotes to say on his friend. We've done a few of them already. He said they don't make them like Rickard anymore, and that he outsmarted some of the most larcenous guys in the history of boxing and out-toughed some of the toughest. Ike Dorgan simply said he could be trusted, and Nat Fleischer called him the greatest fight promoter of all time.
The greatest fight promoter of all time, and probably one of the most forgotten about fight promoters of all time.
Oh my goodness. Look at the story, Sean. I don't think there's I've ever heard anything like this. It's just incredible, isn't it? He is the Forrest Gump of boxing, this guy.
This is an incredible story, guys. If this has not whetted your appetite to do some more research on him, there are books out there. We've mentioned the books. Please go and read them, because this is an absolutely fascinating tale. The problem is, as time's moving forward, people like Tex Rickard get forgotten about. And the people that would have talked about him as historians are all starting to pass on as well as a result. So it's people like us that love the sport so much that we want to delve into the depths of history and tell these stories. This is why we do career profiles and legendary nights. We want to breathe new life into stories that haven't been told either very rarely or not at all. Or if they have been told, it's been a very long time since they have. And there's more new information out there to be able to retell the story in a completely different way. And this is another story that I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed, because we've got to hear about the original man in boxing, the original promoter in boxing. Forget your Don Kings, forget your Bob Arams, forget your Eddie Hearns of this generation, forget anyone else around now, and think about what Tex Rickard did for his time. He was the man of the moment. He was the man that if he wouldn't have died prematurely at 59 years of age, then maybe over the next 10 years, potentially he could have staged some even bigger fights. Think about the fighters that were coming after he passed. Joe Louis, for example. Imagine he would have been able to stage Joe Louis fights. I mean, they would have been unbelievable, the amount of fights he would have been able to stage throughout the 1930s, should he have not passed in that manner too soon. But what he did in the time that he was a boxing promoter is in some ways, it's kind of unrivaled, really. Because, yeah, you can make comparisons to the modern era and what some promoters have done today. But think about the time. Think about the lack of interest in the sport. Think about, what wasn't around then. The technology that isn't, that is here today that wasn't there then. This guy, Tex Rickard, this promoter, was able to do something that I think a lot of the promoters today would struggle to do if they was put into the same situation he was in that period of time. People like Eddie Hearn and Bob Arum now, at this stage of his life, and even Don King, in this generation, they rely heavily on the promotion through social media now. I mean, Bob and Don and people of that nature obviously come from a different period as well, and they had to do a lot of what Tex Rickard had to do in terms of promoting fights, of course. But even still, they had advances in technology, even in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and 90s, to be able to promote fights better. Tex didn't have that. Tex didn't have that level of technology. He was just an out-and-out respected promoter. He was a straight shooter. He didn't circumvent questions, of course, when he was interviewed. He seemed to be straight down the middle. He paid people in the best possible way. He made sure everybody got paid. And really, when you look at the story, you look at everything that we pulled together for the episode, and not many people had a bad word to say about him, if any.
It's true. I mean, the only blemish in this whole story is those reports of the sexual assault. But the more you look at it, it just doesn't seem right, doesn't seem to fit. If something there doesn't seem right. And look, he's innocent. So, I mean, you make your own opinion on it. I mean, you could investigate that more. Who knows? But I do think genuinely, I mean, the guy he was the first to do everything. He really was. He brought women to the sport to come and actually watch and participate in it. The way he was able to promote fights, he had that thing about him. He could sense something, and he worked hard for it. I think the only time the bad words were really said about it was when he actually built the Madison Square Garden, the new one, and at that point he had so many fights that so many people wanted that money, and he was sort of like, they felt like he was a monopoly on his own. But he had just lost his wife, and he had put everything into that. So, you got to say fair play to him. No one else done that. He done it. Other people with money, but he done it. So you can't knock him. And yeah, the fights probably weren't as competitive, but there were some big fights, title fights in there. But you look at the fight show. I mean, you talk about promoters, and when you think of promoters, there's nothing bigger than some of those fights. When you think Johnson, Jeffries, Gans, Nelson, all the blooming Dempsey fights, it's insane. And the amount of $1 million gates he built, and he just wanted to go bigger and bigger. And if he had survived, I mean, he branched out to Boston. He said he wanted to build a garden in pretty much every state, from East Coast to West Coast to South to North. Like, he wanted to have a garden in every place. He wanted to really build his mark, and Miami was his next sort of venture, and obviously he lost his life in the end. But I mean, wow, the stories. I mean, this guy has come through so much, being friends with Theodore Roosevelt, like, and going to his deathbed, and he did seem to be different as well towards racism. I think there was a few quotes that he said, I wasn't, it's the time, I suppose, but you can't really compensate for it. But I do believe, he was always pushing the Jeanette and Langford. He said he would have promoted them fights. It was just the irony of that. And you mentioning Joe Louis, Sean, and our uncle Mike Jacobs comes in, and how much he absolutely rips Joe Louis to bits. And we ain't done a career profile, but we know, Sean, don't we, the ins and outs. If Rickard had survived, I think he would have made Louis money. I think Louis wouldn't have had to come out of retirement. I think he would have retired, happily with a shitload of money. Didn't you think so, Sean? I think if Rickard was next to Louis instead of Uncle Mike, come on, he would have earned him fortunes. It's just like the irony of it, isn't it, how it worked out?
Yeah, it is. And I think this is why we stress about how we love doing these stories, because, you do get some really sad moments and sad stories that we do have to cover. But I think this is one of them where I feel that even though he died relatively young, 60, 59, going on 60. I mean, for the time, I suppose it was probably age expectancy wasn't too much different than that. But however, you kind of think in this day and age now, we think of 80s, sometimes pushing 90s. He's a really, really good sort of average lifespan now. But still, even in the time that he was a boxing promoter, he was able to bring so much to the sport and achieve so much in the sport. But it all began with all the different things we talked about with his investments and his saloons and the cattle ranches. And, this guy was just a hustler, but he was a good hustler. He wasn't the type of guy that was trying to rip people off. He was just trying to make money. And when he just had an eye for investments, he had an eye for business. And that was the thing about him. That's what I've taken from his story, is he knew a good business deal. He knew when something was coming. He knew when to invest in things. And although not everything worked out, the majority of the things did. And from what he made out of boxing was amazing. It was just a shame, as we said at the end of the story, how his daughter was only able to take over just over $100,000 in comparison to what he made. But I suppose, like you said, there's so many different fingers in pies that, you didn't really know the legalities of things at the times and whether there was any evidence and documentation of all this stuff. But
most of it was done on a handshake. I mean, you said it, most things were. But so if he had had a paper trail, I'm guessing he would have had a fortune. But, he didn't. Everything was on a handshake, wasn't it?
But think about the sadness in his life as well. The fact that he lost two wives, 2 children. You know what I mean? That element of his life is quite dreadful as well. And he was still able to circumnavigate his way around businesses and sport and what he knew best. So I hope you guys listening have enjoyed the episode, and I hope we brought Tex Rickard to life in that sense again with his story. And I hope it'll make you go out there and get his books and read them and look at all the literature out there on him. And please, of course, if you've enjoyed it, make sure you share it, because I don't think anybody has really done anything so significant on Tex like we've done for this episode. So make sure you share this. Make sure you tell people that love the history of the sport. Go and listen to this. Go and listen to the original boxing promoter, Tex Rickard. Go and listen to this episode, because I think people will really enjoy it. If you love this sport, you want to know about the origins of boxing promotion, this is the perfect episode to listen to and the perfect person to listen about. And all it'll make you do is probably despise today's promoters even more, because you think...
There's me. I hate promoters as well. I'm singing his praises, even if there is sexual assault charge in the whole story. I'm still sort of not believing it. Maybe if that was someone else, I would have believed it. But it's funny, isn't it? It just shows you. I think as well, Sean, he come from nothing, didn't he? He never had a pot to piss in. He made his own money. And I think he could communicate with the working class, the lower class, the middle class to the upper class. And I think that's what made him different to many.
Well, that is it for this episode. And as always, we like you to go and share the episode on social media. So if you're following us on Twitter, you can do that at career_profiles or at BTR Boxing Pod. And you can find us at BTR Boxing Podcast Network on all available platforms, which includes Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. If you've not subscribed to us, you can find us on any available podcast platform. Apple and Spotify are the most popular, but we are also on YouTube, and the episodes do go up there, the audio versions. So please subscribe to us and like and share in whichever way you possibly can. And a big shout out goes to the patrons of this podcast who subscribe to us via Patreon. With that, they are able to get early access to these episodes, and they're also able to get Patreon-only episodes, as well as having ad-free versions of the episodes. Now, if you've not seen the Patreon page, check it out at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast Network, and you will be able to support us in that way too, if you want to, and get all that in return to be able to get uninterrupted access, uninterrupted versions of the episode. It is certainly worth it for a very minimal amount to provide us. Do it. Yeah, exactly. Do it. Make sure you go on and check it out, even just to have a look at it and just see what we do on there, because we do offer extra content and additional things that we don't necessarily put out to the general public. But that is it for this particular episode. We hope you've enjoyed this two-parter on the life and the career of boxing's original promoter, Tex Rickard.